Okay, hello everyone. This is going to be my second attempt to try and do a much better job with Abenaki history, the history of the Wobanaki Confederacy. Generally, this involves a very wide area and several different nations and tribes. Some that existed before and some that came into existence through the history of this region. And the information is very spread out, and but it's all interconnected. And it was a lot more to process than I was expecting, and a lot more spread out than I was expecting. So I ended up attempting to create two videos. I did a video on the Mii'gmaq and the Maliseet, which did not turn out very well. It was kind of confusing with the added information that I had from the Maliseet and Passamaquoddy and Penobscot. And then there was even more nations going even further on from that. So I'm just redoing this whole thing. So here it goes. Now, basically, the Abenaki all collectively called their land Abenaki, or for the much farther south Massachusetts dialect people, Wobanaki, which means the Dawn Land. And but each one kind of has they split up all the territory into a bunch of separate confederacies, separate nations that each had its own like special name on top of that. But it was a pretty large society constituting the entirety of the land surrounding the Gulf of St. Lawrence and all the islands within, including Anacostia and Newfoundland, all the way down through the states of Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, and even going a little bit into New York at Long Island. They held a large part of Long Island, with the Iroquois up north, with the Iroquois in New York, the Lenape farther south, and a completely different group of people to the far north, forming the borders of all of their land. Within that group, we know of several nations. We had the Mii'gmaq, who were the ones that held the majority of the Gulf of St. Lawrence area. The Maliseet, that held the main Canada border on the eastern side. The Passamaquoddy, who held a small portion of land at the bottom, that's kind of half and half Maine and Canada. Right on the Atlantic Ocean. Then you had the Penobscot, who owned most of what is now the state of Maine, followed by the, going through into New Hampshire, the Kennebec, Androscoggin, and Peqwauket, and then into what is now the state of Vermont, the Androscoggin, Misisoquoi or Sokoki, Cowasuck, and the Penacook. And then the Wampanoaq controlled Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Long Island. These are generally kind of separated into different groups of specific culture, usually by like how similar the language is, but generally there's really only kind of three distinct groups, and you have the ones that were militant, the non-militant migratory groups, and the Wampanoaq are basically your three groups. I'm going to do a separate video on the Wampanoaq because their history and their culture is kind of a lot more focused and a lot more specific, and it has an effect on all of the Abenaki in general. But it's going to be too long to all cover in this one video. So, the best way I guess I could start at is going into prehistory. Now, we don't really know a great deal of what the Abenaki were like beforehand, but it's estimated that they were a lot more nomadic and a lot more tribal, and were not organized into much larger bands. The best thing that I can give you to look at is another tribe from much farther west, again, the Ojibwe and the Odawa, who had a very different kind of society, and they themselves, in their oral history, claim that they also came from the Dawnland, Wobanaki. And but they've retained kind of a very different kind of culture. They're much less centralized. They don't believe in they don't believe in formal religion, institutionalized religion. They don't believe in formal leadership. Generally, whenever they would do something, they would just pick whoever they thought was the best person for the job as the leader in that specific moment for that specific time. But for whatever reason, the Iroquois show up at some point in prehistory, coming down out of Canada and spreading through the Great Lakes region off into New York and the St. Lawrence River, conquering large swathes of land, who had kind of come up with a very different form of society. They lived in settled villages. They had formal government, centralized government. They did a lot more agriculture and farming. And they conquered a very large swathe of North America for themselves. Essentially, if you draw... there's a river that meets the St. Lawrence called the Saguenay. If you draw a line from the Saguenay straight to Lake Huron, and then everything in Canada down to the Detroit River, all the way across into New York, completely surrounding Lake Ontario, and then around Lake Erie all the way to Cleveland, Ohio, all the way down through all of what is now Pennsylvania, and then down the eastern side of Pennsylvania through Maryland to the Chesapeake Bay, was all territory of this one, became all territory of this one nationality, this one group of people. And possibly even further, there's one of the southern tribes, the Cherokee, who pretty much had control of a lot of Tennessee and Alabama, who are considered, they believe that their language is an Iroquois language, although their culture is much more engrossed in like the southern traditions. Supposedly, I'm guessing they mixed traditions with the Mississippian culture that was down there, and developed a very new and distinct kind of culture in that region. But anyway, the Abenakis, going back to that, the Abenakis had a lot of trouble with the Iroquois, so they, who would keep kind of coming in, conquering large swathes of good land that they saw, taking time to settle it, finding the best places, the most defensible areas, and before moving on and to the next place. The Abenaki saw this as a threat and adapted new methods of culture and new forms of leadership and agriculture and day-to-day life, which they thought were giving the Iroquois an advantage. And at some point, something happens in the Iroquois, and this Iroquois empire of sorts begins to fracture into tons of separate nations that we know of: the Wyandot, the Penacook, the Iroquois Confederacy, or the Haudenosaunee, the Wenro, the Susquehanna, the Erie, and the tribes of the St. Lawrence River region. All became separate nations in some sort of very large reorganization of the culture. And in that time, the Abenaki were able to adapt enough, so overall they were able to more or less stabilize their cultural lines and their territories, but the overall conflicts between Iroquois peoples and Abenaki peoples never quite ended. But what they did do to survive, adopting, for the first part, a form of the Iroquois government for themselves, which was having sets of councils made up of chieftains of certain villages, shamans, historians, upstanding people of the society, would organize into groups of councils. And then these councils, for local regions, for districts, would then have one elected member as their head, who would form a confederacy council, thus creating the series of separate lands that you see throughout the Abenaki. Some of them retained being semi-nomadic, usually the ones that were the most furthest removed from Iroquois territory, like the Mii'gmaq and the Passamaquoddy, but the ones that were closer to the Iroquois adopted even further, taking up the practice of settling fortified villages. Now, beginning towards the end of the 1400s, we end up having a lot of countries. The Spanish have discovered North America. They know that it's there. They know there's more than the Caribbean and the West Indies, and lots of countries coveting territory begin sending expeditions to explore it. This coming into a lot of the people like John Cabot, who was John Cabot, Jacques Cartier, Samuel Champlain, going through the end of the 1400s and through the 1500s. Although no one really settles the land, there are several attempts which fail all the way through the 1500s. Roanoke, there was one in Maine, and all through this time period, a lot of sailors began making connections with natives, trying to befriend them, learning their language, getting in close to find out kind of where some of the best places were, trying to gain hunting rights, trying to gain fishing rights, and kind of exploring this whole eastern coast of North America, all the way up into the St. Lawrence River. However, they also bring diseases, which begins decimating a lot of these tribes in series of epidemics. Presumably, it started with the St. Lawrence River Iroquois people, who were much more diversified, potentially much more diversified. We really don't know anything about them. The only person who ever came in contact with them was Samuel de Champlain, and by the time people came back, they were gone. We really don't know what happened to them. Archaeologically, we think perhaps the Mohawk, who were starting to get a little antsy, decided to go on a conquering spree and execute a lot of other tribes and swallow up their land to give them a better chance of survival, potentially. A better chance to stand up against whites if they incur into their territory. But the one thing that we know for certain is that after they left, trading posts established in the general vicinity of the St. Lawrence River drew a lot more Native Americans into that area. So the Iroquois moved up, the Mohawk specifically moved up along the St. Lawrence River, and a lot of the Abenaki tribes who had been blocked off from that region by the St. Lawrence River Iroquois peoples, with those peoples gone for whatever reason had happened, they moved their territory up to the St. Lawrence River. Groups like the Maliseet and the Penobscot, who had the best access and were a little bit further from the remaining Iroquois in New York. But let's just try to keep this as simple as I can. the first contact, of course, being with John Cabot in 1497. Of course, I don't know how the heck this guy managed to even get this job. This was his second expedition, and the only thing we know about his first expedition was he had wrote a letter requesting a reference to Christopher Columbus so he could get this job, and in that letter he explicitly tells Christopher Columbus, "As to my first expedition, well, we went the wrong way and we got lost, and then my crew kept confusing me while we were trying to figure out where we were and where we were supposed to go, but eventually we ran out of food and we had to go back." Of course, John Cabot managed to make it to the United States. He managed to explore a lot of the St. Lawrence River region and Maine, but we have no clue where he was, other than it's somewhere in that general area. We've never been able to establish exactly where that guy was. But he made contact with the Mii'gmaq, which he came to refer to as the Mikmaq. But the Mii'gmaq, their name derives from what they call their land, Mii'gmaq, which is the land of our family. And there were not very many explicit contacts and government-funded contacts with these people for a very long time. We know that Jacques Cartier came through that area. We know Samuel de Champlain came through the area. There was another one, Vernazo, who went through there. But it does not, nothing that they try to, no European attempts to really establish themselves in this region sticks until the 1600s. The French establish a settlement in what is now Maine in 1604. It fails that year, but the very next year they establish a new settlement further up the coast in what is now those islands right off the edge of Canada, in the region of Canada known as Acadia. And most of the survivors from that first settlement abandoned the original one and moved there. But for that basic reason, France claimed most of Maine, but had no real settlements there to establish that as their land. Later on, Dutch explorers from the Netherlands would come in, but they would never manage to fully establish any control of that land. Eventually, the English takes control of it, as they take control of all of the colonies up the coast from Georgia to Maine. Obviously, though, them claiming Maine when France claimed Maine kind of creates a political conflict. Now, natives would, of course, get hit with, slammed with epidemic after epidemic of disease through the 1600s all the way clear into the 1700s, really damaging a lot of their territory. By the end of this, the Mi'gmaq territory had shrunk. They'd lost all the land on the northern part of St. Lawrence and all of the islands in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and now only controlled a small portion of land in what is now Acadia. Meanwhile, several other tribes would be very, very seriously devastated by disease, including the Wampanoaq, and a lot of the tribes directly north of them, the Penacook, and several others, as well as some other Lenape groups, who controlled kind of the southern portion of New York and a little tiny sliver of Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Vermont. Would get a lot of the same. Now, the first few people who started coming to the U.S., to the U.S. and Canada, it was largely for religious freedom, and they made they understood the worth of the natives and saw them as assets, and they really worked hard, especially like the Pilgrims of Plymouth Rock and several other communities worked very hard to establish good relations with the natives. They always asked for what they took. They established treaties dictating where they could and could not go, where they could and could not hunt, where they could and could not live. But as time went on, some other religious groups who were a lot more conservative and a lot more secular, as well as people who were just who just wanted opportunity, business opportunity, the chance at a different kind of life or to escape crime, started flooding into the colonies, and they did not treat the natives as well. A lot of the larger religious groups, such as the Puritans, saw the natives as unpure and didn't want anything to do with them, and went out of their way to openly insult them and to openly insult treaties that had been made and damage relations with the natives by pushing them farther away and taking land that was not theirs, just kind of establishing themselves all over the place with no accord. And the governors who had already established themselves in this region could not control these people who didn't respect them either because of their religious views. Eventually, it leads into such a series of annoying, crazy conflicts. The English get involved in the English government's forced to get involved in a very cheap and lazy way. They just try to keep everyone separate and happy and not fighting each other. They establish treaties with some of the Native Americans to keep them out of the way. They try to appease the Puritans, and this does not work. The situation keeps getting harsher and harsher. Eventually the Puritans decide, well, okay, there is one way that we will accept the natives if they stop being Native American. So they came up with this idea, okay, we're going to build all these towns, which they came to call praying towns, and we're going to invite the natives to come and live here if they will convert to Christianity. And when they convert to Christianity and wear our clothes and treat their women like we treat our women and speak our language and do our kinds of jobs, then we'll think about respecting them. But they do have to live over there in those towns away from us. And this does not go over incredibly well, but on top of that, the new treaties kind of piss off a lot of the tradesmen, who now have to rely on certain circumstances in order to get special goods, like certain kinds of hides and certain kinds of things from Native American territory that they cannot get themselves now because of these treaties. They can only get them through trade. I'm not entirely sure about this, but it seems like the most likely explanation. But they began attempting to come up with ways to get the most from the Native Americans by giving them the least. And what came out of that was they started trying to, knowing that Native Americans did not really have a lot of alcohol, there's not a very big alcohol culture in Native America. They did have alcohol, but they did not kind of openly consume it. Most of it was corn-based. The Abenakis had what they called pine beer, or as the English started calling it, nettle beer, which they used as medicine for certain kinds of circumstances. Iroquois would use a type of fermentation process to preserve certain kinds of foods. The Aztecs also had a kind of a corn beer called pulque, which if you're ever in southern Mexico, they still have these pulque bars that you can get to, which was for drinking, but they did not tolerate alcoholism, one of the only good things out of all of Aztec culture. They would give you 3 strikes for public alcoholism, and then they killed you. But But anyway, the Europeans knew that Native Americans did not have a whole lot of an alcohol culture, so they tried to unload a crapload of cheap liquor on them in return for trade goods, so that they were getting the best possible deal, and convinced a lot of natives to fall into habits of alcoholism. This unfortunately benefited the idea of the praying towns, because Native American women would attempt to leave their husbands or bring their families to the whites to try to undo the problems caused by the alcoholism, and they would only help if they converted to Christianity. So a lot of these women did, and it actually really confused and disturbed and upset the Europeans, that the women kind of almost seemed to control more of the culture than the men did, and it was up to the women that these families were converting to Christianity, even though in Christianity it's the man's job to control the household. But eventually they kind of just they really didn't know what to make of it for the longest time, but eventually they just got over it and accepted it through the basic fact that it was working. And they filled up a lot of these praying towns, which unfortunately, due to going into the border disputes also with the French, who had claimed a large portion of land that England also claimed, and it kind of disclaimed the Abenakis in general, got pissed off that they thought that this was England's plan to supplant them in the New World and to cut them off. So they get mad. They start coming into English territory and opening tons of Catholic monasteries to convert natives to Catholicism so that they could control the Abenaki population and force the English out. And it turns into this whole annoying game of using Christianity and natives as pawns to try to control land that was never theirs to begin with. This eventually leads into open conflict. One of the chiefs of the Wampanoaq, his real name escapes me, but he took on the white name Philip to deal with the Europeans. Things do not go incredibly well. He starts trusting whites less and less, which makes the whites upset and makes them believe that he's up to something. Eventually, King Philip gets pissed, or this Philip person gets angry, and decides he's going to start a war. So he goes among several Abenaki tribes and Lenape tribes, trying to convince them to join him in a joined effort to drive Europeans out of their land. And most of them don't want anything to do with this. But he gets a couple of Lenape tribes to join with the Wampanoag, and even though it was not initially, even though they do hold off, they don't initially start an all-out war. Things do go wrong, and in 1675, war breaks out, which we end up calling, history comes to call King Philip's War, where this Wampanoag chief, Philip, and organized with a couple of other Lenape tribes, begins a war with the Europeans. And as the war starts, the Europeans start attacking tons of Abenaki settlements and tribes that actually have nothing to do with the war and wanted nothing to do with the war. And out of anger and out of frustration, more and more Abenaki tribes who initially said they did not want to join the war joined the war on Philip's side, until they all formed together into what ends up becoming the Wobanaki Confederacy. Unfortunately, though, the war does not go well overall. They do lose in the end. towards the end in 1678, most of Philip's forces decimated. He goes hiding in the mountains, and then they find the settlement where his family lives, destroys it, ends up capturing his family without even realizing that they've captured his family, and sold his family into slavery in Bermuda, among tons of other native prisoners of war that they had captured. And shortly after that, King Philip is finally found, taken out, beheaded, and his head is placed on a pike, literally for several years, put on display on a pike in Plymouth, Massachusetts. The remaining Abenakis largely fractured. The ones farther north in French-controlled territories, being the Mii'gmaq, the Maliseet, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot in the disputed territory, kind of stay more or less the way they always had been, but the rest of the tribes are decimated. Several flee to the north and to the west, creating two separate tribal entities, just made up entirely of survivors of the Wampanoaq, Kennebec, Androscoggin, Peqwauket, Androscoggin, Misisoquoi, and Cowasuck. Not all of the natives entirely flee this area. At the time, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine are not exactly settled, so a lot of natives manage to stay there and never end up leaving. Also, a lot of the ones that converted to Christianity and had merged into society in Massachusetts stayed where they were as well. But a lot of the Wampanoag and a couple of the other Abenaki tribes and some Lenape flee west into what used to be Iroquois territory that's lost due to illness, and become a new tribe called the Schaghticoke, something like that. And meanwhile, a lot of others flee into Canada, into the St. Lawrence River territory near Quebec, hoping that the French will give them asylum, and they become the Abenaki tribes, with the French establishing probably the first reservations ever for native peoples in North America, Wobanaki and Odanak, which are now considered Abenaki reservations to this day. Now, things do not particularly improve. England and France get into it pretty hard and come into a series of wars over the next several years, with King William's War and Queen Anne's War being the first to come through the 1600s. And with the Abenakis getting kind of fed up with the English and being driven more to driven more into French territory, where they're converted to Catholicism. A lot of them are. They end up joining more with the French ideas, and help the French in their war efforts, hoping to at least get rid of the English, and then they can worry about what to do from there. The English had, through the entirety of King Philip's War, been pretty wary of trusting natives. But after the Abenaki becomes such a annoyance, they end up joining formally with the Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois Confederacy, that we know of today as their allies, who are the natural enemies of the Abenaki, and thus creates an increasingly worse and worse situation for these peoples. Which eventually puts into motion the events that would cause the Beaver Wars, when there's a massive war between Iroquois peoples and Lenape peoples and some other peoples who had managed to make it to Ohio over control of that territory, which goes through a lot of the American Revolution into the end of the 1700s, and ultimately is pointless because by 1803 Ohio begins to be settled by whites. things do get very awkward through King Philip's War and Queen Anne's War, which are not necessarily being waged in the colonies; they're being waged in Europe. They keep trying to both sides keep trying to use it as a blind to do things in the colonies before the other nation notices, to try to gain support, gain control of land, take over large swathes of territory, and it increases hostilities pretty harshly. Eventually, the French get fed up. They start paying the Catholic preachers to when they realize that they're starting to lose territory, that they're starting to get into trouble, they start paying their Catholic preachers at their monasteries to intentionally drive the Abenakis to war with the English, which eventually results in what we call Drummer's War or Father Rail's War in 1722 to 1725, which involved a lot of the remaining Abenaki tribes that were left, the Mii'gmaq, Maliseet, and Penobscot and Passamaquoddy. The war does not obviously go well. They end up losing, but things even out. The English finally manages to take over that territory in the French and Indian War that follows, and with that, the conflicts are pretty much over, but the natives are very upset. They reach out to the French government asking why this is happening, how this could happen. And the French respond saying, well, according to European law that goes all the way back to the Crusades, laws that were created intentionally to drive the Crusades, a non-Christian cannot own land. So since the French were the first people who were Christian, who claimed that land in the name of France, were the first to see that land, the first Christians to see that land, that meant that their land that they had always lived on belonged to the French, and now that England had beaten them fair and square in war, so now that land belonged to England. It's from this point that a lot of the Catholics, who now feel like a minority in their own, who now feel like their supremacy is in danger, and natives who also feel their supremacy in danger, they get driven even closer together, becoming an almost seamless community. England drafts treaties to try to reason with them and try and keep things under control, saying that they're going to give them fair consideration in the laws and the way they're going to do things in this land, both for the French citizens and for the native citizens, but this turns out to be a lie. Shortly after that, in the year 1749, England intentionally creates and settles the city of Halifax in Mi'gmaq territory, driving tons of Protestants to move there to upset the balance of the Catholics and the natives, which pisses them off, causing the Mikmaq War, which lasts from 1749 to 1755 in that region. Obviously, it did not work out for those people, because there is no sovereign nation of Acadia over there, but they did manage to settle themselves and keep a lot of their rights. And to this day, a lot of the Mii'gmaq and the Maliseet and Passamaquoddy all still live in this in this general area, and have really never left, each having their own reservations. We know the Passamaquoddy technically does not consider, or Canada does not consider the Passamaquoddy a sovereign nation or a native nation, but the United States does, which is a very weird circumstance. Usually Canada shares in that equally with tribes that are on the border, or at least historically, it seems like they give more priority to natives than America does, or America has, even though they have also in the past shared in attacking and destroying and damaging Native Americans as much as anyone else. But as you can imagine, all of these tons of armed conflicts destabilizes the region for natives even more, driving tons and tons of permanent military families and permanent military settlements all across this entire region, claiming more and more and more territory, and now it pretty much all officially belongs to England. At this point we come to the American Revolution, which the Abenaki see as an opportunity. Some of the remaining Abenakis, particularly the Penobscot, join with the American, the Patriots, to try to take back their land, to create a new country. Unfortunately, in the end, it does not work out for them. Were you expecting anything different? At the end, the United States does win and gets itself established, but they refuse to admit any help from the Abenakis, and actually go so far as to go to the Penobscot and some of the remaining Abenaki people, round them up and push them into what they call Indian towns, which were kind of small areas about the size of a county. And once they had them in the Indian towns, they forced their leaders to sign over all of their land to the United States government, so the United States government could sell it to build up their coffers, which they saw as a potential much better way to gain money than by taxing people, because the American Revolution was all about taxes. That was why they had gotten into the war to begin with, and with such a unstable place that they had found themselves in, they didn't want to be seen as hypocrites. So they decided to do something a lot worse, but unfortunately something that they didn't think anyone would complain about in any way, shape, or form at the time. And pretty much even this goes through the end of the 1700s into the early 1800s, that they're still convincing the Abenaki to give up their land while it's being settled, while Maine is becoming Maine in the middle of this, while a lot of this land still belongs to the Penobscot tribe, becomes an official state in the United States. And it is towards the end of these early 1800s that it is assumed by people that the Abenaki are actually extinct in the United States. Now, in all honesty, they were not extinct. Not only were there the natives that were in the Indian towns, they didn't even manage to round up all the natives. A lot of natives stayed where they were. There were natives who had converted to Christianity who stayed where they were in one form or another. Some natives managed to escape the Indian towns and return home. And there managed to be kind of underground native communities who had converted to a white way of living, but were never really thought about, never really assumed that they were not white until we get to the 1970s, really is the point where they all started, there was a resurgence in interest in Native American culture and Native American identity. And a lot of these people started looking into their histories and finding irrefutable proof that not just them, but a lot of people in their towns, in their region, were all Native American, were Abenaki, were Lenape, among other things. And they've never really, I don't think they've ever really been given tribal rights. I think a few of them might have. Maybe, I think the Misisoquoi Abenakis maybe were returned tribal rights. I don't know. And we know the Penobscot have actually managed to turn U.S. law to their favor and have gotten a lot of their land returned to them as well, through coming up with ways to make money, going to law, suing the United States, gaining money, using the money to buy more land, using that land to make more money, and that's been working out for them pretty well. They've gotten a pretty large swathe of their territory back. Pretty much the last thing I kind of have to say on that point is with the American Revolution ending, a lot of the people who were still loyal to the crown left the colonies and moved to Canada, and England further disseminated the region by deciding that they were going to segregate all the people, not just the natives from the whites, but also the French whites from the English whites from the natives, and give them all their own section, which is why you have French Canada. Even though most of Canada speaks English, you have that one special part of Canada that's French. And a lot of natives, a lot of the Iroquois and Algonquin people either moved further north or further south, crossing into America, and establishing permanent settlements in places like Ohio, at least until, again, the Beaver Wars wiped them out. But that's pretty much all there really is to the Abenaki story. Again, I will do a separate story. I'll do a separate video on the Wampanoag. I'll do a separate video on each of the wars, if I can find specific information. But hopefully this one's a lot more informative and makes more sense to people than the last two that I did. So, that's all I got. Thank you.